On the night of October 8th, 1871, a wall of fire more than a mile high moved across northeastern Wisconsin faster than a freight train. It didn't creep. It didn't spread slowly the way campfires do when the wind picks up. It exploded. Witnesses who survived described a sound like 1,000 locomotives screaming at once, and a heat so intense that the air itself seemed to ignite. Trees didn't burn, they vaporized. Rivers boiled. People running toward Lake Michigan to escape the flames died before they reached the water, not from burns, but from the sheer force of the superheated air collapsing their lungs. By morning, the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, was gone. Completely gone. Roughly 1,200 people were dead, though some estimates put the number closer to 2,500, because so many entire families were wiped out that no one was left to report them missing. The deadliest wildfire in American history had come and gone in a single night. However, almost nobody in America talked about it. Not then, and not now. Because on that exact same night, in Chicago, a different fire started. And for reasons that say a lot about how this country decides what matters and what doesn't, the world looked away from Peshtigo. The real question isn't just why the fire happened. The real question is how the logging industry created the conditions for a disaster this catastrophic, and then walked away without ever having to answer for it. If this story is new to you, that's not an accident. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series, where we dig into history's forgotten disasters and the industries that caused them. And if you already know someone who'd find this fascinating, this is the video to send them. To understand what happened in Peshtigo, you first have to understand what northeastern Wisconsin looked like in the 1860s, because the landscape itself was almost unrecognizable compared to anything you'd see today. The region was covered in one of the largest and densest forests in North America. Old-growth white pine stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Trees so tall they blocked out most of the sunlight at ground level. The forest floor was thick with roots and brush, and decades of fallen needles and dried leaves packed down into a kind of spongy mat that extended as far as anyone could walk. For the Menominee and Ojibwe people who had lived in and around this forest for generations, it was home, a source of food and shelter and spiritual life. For the logging companies arriving from the east in the 1850s and 1860s, it looked like an almost limitless fortune waiting to be extracted. Peshtigo itself was a small logging town, just a few thousand people, built almost entirely on the promise of timber. It sat along the Peshtigo River, which was wide enough and fast enough to carry logs downstream to Green Bay, where they'd be processed and shipped to cities across the Midwest, Chicago, which was growing at a pace that shocked even its own residents, needed wood desperately. Wood for houses, wood for boardwalks, wood for the expanding rail lines, wood for everything. And Peshtigo was one of the places supplying it. By 1871, the town had a woodenware factory, dozens of homes and businesses, a church, a school, and a company store. Nearly everything in it was built from wood. The sidewalks were wood. The roads in many places were paved with wood planks. Even the sawdust from the mills had been spread across the streets and packed into the spaces between buildings as a kind of cheap filler material. In a town surrounded by a vast and drying forest, in the middle of one of the driest summers on record, Peshtigo was essentially a fire waiting for a spark. But the town's residents weren't especially worried. Fires were common in logging country. Small fires broke out regularly through the summer and fall, and most of them burned out on their own or were contained quickly. The men who worked in the forests were used to it. They'd stomp out fires near their camps almost routinely. The idea that a fire could become large enough to swallow an entire region in a matter of hours was simply outside of most people's ability to imagine. Nobody had ever seen anything like that before, and so nobody prepared for it. One man, more than anyone else, shaped what Peshtigo was and what it was about to become. His name was William Butler Ogden, and if you know anything about 19th century American industry, you've probably encountered him in another context, because Ogden was also the first mayor of Chicago. He had been one of the architects of Chicago's rise, a man who understood better than almost anyone how to turn raw land and raw materials into enormous wealth. By 1871, he had shifted much of his attention northward to the forests of Wisconsin, where he owned the Peshtigo Company, which controlled the town's sawmill, the woodenware factory, and a significant portion of the surrounding timberland. Ogden also owned the Peshtigo Harbor Company, which managed the port where logs were shipped out. And he had invested heavily in the railroads pushing through the northern forests. This was not unusual. Many of the major figures in the 19th century timber industry were simultaneously railroad investors, land speculators, and town builders, men who controlled entire chains of the economy from the forest floor to the factory floor. What it meant in practical terms was that when Ogden and men like him made decisions about how quickly to cut timber or how to manage the land after it was logged, those decisions were essentially final. There was no competing interest in the region powerful enough to push back against them. The workers who actually did the logging were almost entirely poor immigrants, many of them from Scandinavia and Ireland, men who had come to the upper Midwest because the timber industry was one of the few places that would hire them steadily. They lived in company-owned housing, shopped at company-owned stores, and were paid wages that kept them just comfortable enough to stay, but never comfortable enough to leave. When they looked at the slash piling up around their camps, at the creeks running low, at the smoke sitting on the horizon through September and into October, they had no realistic way to stop working. Stopping work meant losing your housing, losing your access to the company store, losing everything the company had extended to you on credit, and above them, insulated from all of it by distance and wealth. Men like William Ogden received their reports from the operations and saw no reason to slow down. The summer of 1871 had been brutally dry across the entire upper Midwest. The region hadn't seen significant rainfall since July. By October, the soil was like powder. The creeks had dropped to near nothing. Even the swampy areas, which normally stayed wet well into autumn, had dried out. And all across the forests surrounding Peshtigo, the logging companies were still working at full speed. The logging industry in 1871 was not careful. That's not a criticism applied unfairly from a modern perspective. It's simply what the historical record shows, and it's critical to understanding why the Peshtigo fire became what it became. When logging crews moved through a section of forest, their goal was singular: get the biggest, most valuable trees out as fast as possible. They were working under contracts that demanded speed for companies that were racing each other to strip as much timber from public and private lands as they could before competitors got there first. The idea that any forest resource could be exhausted or that there might be long-term consequences to how they operated was not something the industry thought about seriously in that era. The forest was treated as something that simply existed to be taken. The process left behind a landscape that looked almost like a war zone. After a logging crew had moved through, what remained were the tops of the felled trees, the branches, the stumps, and all the smaller trees and brush that hadn't been worth cutting for timber. This material was called slash, and it was left exactly where it fell. Loggers didn't haul it out or burn it in controlled conditions or chip it or do anything at all with it. They left mountains of it behind, dried and tangled, and piled sometimes 10 or 15 feet deep across entire sections of forest. By the fall of 1871, the areas around Peshtigo that had been logged in recent years were covered in this slash, and after a summer without rain, it had dried to the consistency of kindling. The logging companies had, without intending to, and without any particular concern for what they were leaving behind, created one of the most flammable landscapes that region had ever seen. On top of that, the logging railroads had been expanding rapidly through the forests during the same period. The rail companies and the logging companies were often the same investors working together. And as new rail lines were cut through the forest, workers would clear the trees along the right-of-way by burning them. These burns were not carefully managed. Workers would start a fire to clear the vegetation, keep an eye on it for a while, and then move on, trusting that rain or natural barriers would stop it from spreading. In a normal year, this was reckless, but usually manageable. In the fall of 1871, after months of drought, it was an act of extraordinary danger. In the weeks before October 8th, there were already fires burning in multiple locations across the region. Smoke had been visible from Peshtigo for days. Some of the smaller settlements had already lost outbuildings and fields to creeping fires that nobody had successfully contained. The air had taken on a yellowish haze that made afternoons feel strange and unsettling, and the smell of smoke was constant, but the loggers kept working. The sawmill in Peshtigo kept running. The railroad crews kept burning along their new right-of-ways. Nobody in any position of authority called for a stop to any of it. There were people who understood the danger. A Wisconsin newspaper called the Green Bay Advocate had been running notices through September, warning that the dry conditions and the accumulated slash around logging settlements created a serious fire risk. A few local farmers had written letters to regional officials expressing concern about the fires they could see burning on the edges of the logged areas. There is at least one account of a logging camp foreman who sent a message to his company supervisors in early October, describing the conditions around the camp as dangerous and asking for guidance on whether to pull his crew out temporarily. No response is recorded in the surviving documents, or if one was sent, it hasn't been found. The crew stayed. This is one of the most important and underappreciated parts of the Peshtigo story, because it pushes back against the idea that nobody could have seen this coming. People did see it coming, or at least saw the conditions that made something like it possible. The warnings existed, they circulated, at least locally, and they were either ignored or never reached the people with the power to act on them. The industry's relationship with fire risk in 1871 wasn't one of pure ignorance. It was one of calculated indifference. The fires were a known cost of doing business in the logged-over forests of the upper Midwest. And as long as those fires stayed small enough to not threaten the operations directly, they were someone else's problem. The men who made decisions about how the logging operations ran were not in Peshtigo. They were in offices in Chicago and Milwaukee and New York. They received reports about the timber being extracted and the money being made, and if they heard anything about fires in the region at all, it was framed as a routine seasonal problem that their crews were handling. The people who actually understood how dangerous the situation had become were the loggers, the farmers, and the townspeople living in the middle of it, and they had no power to stop what was coming. We're about halfway through this story, and things are about to get very dark. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time, because this channel covers exactly these kinds of forgotten histories, where industries made decisions that cost ordinary people everything, and then faced almost no consequences. Hit subscribe and the bell, so you actually see the next one. October 8th, 1871, started as an ordinary Sunday evening in Peshtigo. People had been to church. Families were having their evening meals. The smoke on the horizon was nothing new, just more of the same haze that had been sitting over the region for weeks. The fires that had been burning in the surrounding forests were still out there, but they'd been burning for a while without reaching the town, and most people had settled into an uncomfortable but manageable anxiety about them. What almost no one understood was that the weather was about to change in a way that would turn every burning acre in the region into something catastrophically different. A cold front was pushing down from the north, and as it collided with the warm, dry air that had been sitting over Wisconsin all summer, it created something that fire scientists today call a firestorm. A firestorm isn't just a large fire. It's a fire that has grown large enough to create its own weather. The heat of the burning landscape generates massive updrafts, pulling in surrounding air at tremendous speed and feeding the fire with a constant surge of fresh oxygen. The winds don't just push the fire forward. They accelerate it, spin it, and lift it, sending burning material miles ahead of the main front and starting new fires before the original has even arrived. The whole system feeds itself, growing more intense the larger it becomes. In Peshtigo, the first sign that something different was happening came around 9 o'clock at night, when a wind that witnesses described as sudden and violent hit the town from the southwest. Within minutes, embers were falling from the sky, not the occasional floating spark that people were used to during fire season, but a blizzard of burning debris raining down on the wooden buildings and wooden streets and dried wooden sidewalks of the town. Multiple fires started almost simultaneously. There was no time to fight them, and there was nowhere near enough water. The surviving accounts from Peshtigo are almost unbearable to read. A priest named Peter Pernin, who survived by wading into the Peshtigo River and staying submerged while the fire passed overhead, wrote one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of what happened that night. He described people running in every direction, unable to see more than a few feet ahead because of the smoke and darkness and cascading embers. He described hearing the sound of the firestorm before seeing it, a roar that he compared to the sound of an enormous waterfall mixed with a constant crashing that he couldn't fully describe. He described seeing the fire arrive not as a wave on the ground, but as a column of fire sweeping across the sky, burning trees that were already behind the main front, already apparently past the fire, suddenly igniting in the air above him. Families who ran toward the river were the ones most likely to survive. Those who ran into cellars or tried to hide in their houses died. The fire burned so hot and moved so fast that even brick structures couldn't protect the people inside them. Several families drowned in the river, having made it to the water, but been overcome by the crush of people and animals doing the same thing. Horses and cattle ran into the river alongside people. Dogs ran burning through the streets. A woman who survived described standing in the river up to her neck, holding her baby above the water, watching both riverbanks burn simultaneously, while ash and burning debris fell around her. The town was gone in less than an hour. By the time the firestorm had moved through, approximately 1.5 million acres across northeastern Wisconsin had burned. This included not just Peshtigo, but a dozen smaller communities, hundreds of farms, and virtually everything the logging industry had built in the region over the previous 2 decades. The forests that had fed the industry, and that the industry's own practices had helped transform into a tinderbox, were now ash. It's worth pausing on those smaller communities, because Peshtigo gets most of the attention when this story is told, even in the rare cases when it's told at all. But the fire didn't only destroy Peshtigo. It burned through the Sugarbush settlement, where a large community of Belgian immigrants had been farming for years, clearing land and building a stable life in the Wisconsin countryside. It burned through Williamsonville. It burned through Brussels and Rosier and a half-dozen other small farming and logging settlements scattered across the peninsula north of Green Bay. In some of these communities, entire extended families were wiped out in a single night, parents and grandparents and children and cousins, all gone together, in places so small and so isolated that the news of their destruction barely registered anywhere outside the immediate region. The fire burned so differently in the open farmland of the peninsula than it did in the logged-over forests near Peshtigo. In the farming communities, the fields of dried crops acted as fuel, and the farmhouses with their wooden barns and outbuildings caught and burned quickly. Families who had worked for years to clear their land and build something permanent found that permanence could be undone in minutes. Survivors of the Sugarbush settlement described trying to carry children through burning fields, the ground itself glowing with heat, in landscapes that bore no resemblance to the peaceful farmland they had woken up in that morning. The official death count from Peshtigo and the surrounding area was reported at 1,182 people. However, historians and researchers looking at the records more carefully have consistently argued that the real number was almost certainly higher, probably somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people, because in communities where entire families were wiped out, there was no one left to provide a name to any list. Bodies in some areas were so completely destroyed that identification was impossible. Mass graves were dug because there was no other option. It remains to this day the deadliest wildfire in American history. Not close. The next deadliest fire events in American history killed hundreds of people. Peshtigo killed over 1,000 in a single night, possibly twice that. Here is the terrible irony at the center of the Peshtigo story. On the exact same night that Peshtigo burned, October 8th, 1871, a fire broke out in Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire would kill approximately 300 people, destroy about 3.5 square miles of the city, and leave roughly 100,000 people homeless. It was a catastrophic disaster. Nobody disputes that. But Chicago was Chicago. It was one of the most important cities in the country, a financial and cultural hub, home to businesses and newspapers and influential people who had the connections and resources to make sure their story reached the rest of the nation. The Great Chicago Fire was covered by newspapers across the country and around the world. Relief efforts were organized almost immediately. Money poured in from other cities. The federal government took notice. The story of Chicago's fire became one of the defining moments of that era, told and retold across American history. Peshtigo's story barely made the papers. The Chicago fire was happening at the exact moment that journalists and telegraph operators were already scrambling to cover the biggest urban disaster story of the year. And a fire in rural Wisconsin, no matter how many people it killed, simply couldn't compete for attention. The Wisconsin papers that did cover Peshtigo were themselves dealing with the difficulty of communicating out of a region where roads and telegraph lines had burned. The reports that did reach major newspapers were incomplete, confused, and buried under the avalanche of Chicago coverage. This was not a conspiracy. Nobody decided to suppress the Peshtigo story. It was something more mundane and in some ways more troubling, a demonstration of how geography and wealth and existing infrastructure determine which tragedies get to be remembered and which ones get quietly forgotten. The people who died in Peshtigo were loggers and farmers and their families, ordinary working-class people in a remote area. They didn't have advocates in the press. They didn't have wealthy patrons sending money and writing letters on their behalf. What little federal and private relief reached the region came weeks later, long after the immediate crisis had passed for those who survived it. The logging industry, for its part, moved on with remarkable speed. Within a few years, logging operations in the region had resumed. The forests grew back slowly, as forests do, and the industry followed the new growth and the uncut timber that had survived in adjacent areas. The companies that had created the slash fields, that had been burning railroad right-of-ways through drought conditions, that had been operating at full speed in a landscape that any reasonably observant person could see was catastrophically dry, faced no legal consequences, and no significant public accountability. A few newspaper editorials noted that logging practices were dangerous. Nobody of consequence was forced to change anything. There was no investigation in the modern sense, no government. Commission was convened to determine the role of logging practices in creating fire conditions. No industry leaders were called before Congress. The survivors of Peshtigo were given some aid, helped to rebuild their homes, and then the world moved on. And so the deadliest wildfire in American history settled into the category of things that happened in the past, to people who are no longer alive to demand an accounting. The contrast in how relief reached Chicago versus how it reached Peshtigo tells you almost everything you need to know about what each place meant to the country at large. Chicago had its disaster on the same night, and within days, relief shipments were moving toward the city from across the nation. $30 million worth of aid in 1871 dollars was ultimately directed toward Chicago's recovery, a figure that represented contributions from other American cities, from European governments, and from private donors who had seen their own investments and connections tied up in Chicago's commercial life. The city rebuilt within years, and in many respects, the fire accelerated its growth by clearing older, shoddier construction and replacing it with more modern structures. Wisconsin Governor Lucius Fairchild, who was himself away in Europe when the fire happened, eventually organized a relief commission for the Peshtigo area after returning home. The commission did distribute aid, including food, clothing, and some building materials, and some private charitable donations did eventually reach the region. But the scale was incomparably smaller, and the speed was far slower. Weeks passed before organized relief was fully moving into the burned communities. In the meantime, survivors were living in whatever had survived the fire, or in shelters thrown together from whatever scraps could be found, as the Wisconsin autumn turned cold. William Ogden, whose company had owned much of what burned in Peshtigo, reportedly suffered significant financial losses in the fire, including the destruction of his Chicago property in the Chicago fire that same night. Whether he contributed to Peshtigo's recovery in any significant way is not clearly established in the historical record. The Peshtigo Company eventually resumed operations in the area, and the economic logic of the timber trade reasserted itself as the region slowly recovered. For the industry, Peshtigo was an interruption. For the people who had lived there, it was everything. The Peshtigo fire is not entirely forgotten. There is a museum in the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, which is still there, rebuilt, and still home to a few thousand people. The museum keeps the records of those who died and those who survived, the letters and the accounts and the artifacts pulled from the rubble. There is a memorial cemetery. The town holds commemorations on the anniversary of the fire, and the local historical society works hard to keep the story from disappearing entirely. But outside of Wisconsin, and outside of the relatively small community of people who care about American environmental history, Peshtigo is unknown. You can ask 100 reasonably educated Americans about the deadliest wildfire in American history, and a significant number of them will not know it happened. The ones who do often have a personal connection to Wisconsin or to logging history. It isn't taught in most school curricula. It rarely appears in the popular histories of 19th century America. This matters, and not just as a question of historical fairness to the people who died. The Peshtigo fire was an early and devastating demonstration of what happens when an extractive industry operates without any meaningful constraints on how it manages the land it's using. The slash left behind by logging operations in Wisconsin in 1871 was not a secret problem that the industry was unaware of. People who worked in the forests knew it was there. people who studied fire behavior knew that large amounts of dried woody debris created serious fire risk. The problem was that there was no structure in place, no regulation, no legal requirement, no industry standard that obligated the logging companies to do anything about it. In the years and decades following the Peshtigo fire, the connection between logging practices and wildfire risk became more widely understood. The catastrophic fires that burned through Idaho and Montana in 1910, a series of fires that killed 85 people and burned 3 million acres in 2 days, helped push the federal government toward creating a more organized approach to fire management on public lands. These fires, sometimes called the Big Blow-Up or the Big Burn, contributed to the formation of the United States Forest Service's firefighting mission and the development of a national fire suppression policy. But the lessons that Peshtigo could have taught, if it had received the attention that its scale deserved, came much later and much more slowly than they should have. The idea that private timber operations on private land should be required to manage the fire risk created by their own activities took generations to begin to take hold, and in many respects, that conversation is still unfinished. Today, wildfires in the American West kill people every year, destroy communities, and burn millions of acres. The causes are complex and interconnected, but they include a significant component of forest management decisions, accumulated dried debris in forests, development patterns that put homes in high-risk areas, and a warming climate that creates the same kind of drought conditions that dried out Wisconsin in 1871. The specific mechanics are different. The scale is different. The political and regulatory context is entirely different from anything that existed in the 19th century. But the fundamental dynamic in which the management of forested land creates conditions that kill people is not a new problem. Peshtigo knew that in 1871. The 1,200 people who died in Peshtigo, or the 2,500, or however many it actually was, lived in a town that was built by logging, that existed because of logging, and that was destroyed in large part because of how logging was practiced around it. They were not passive victims of a random natural disaster. They were people caught in the consequences of specific decisions made by specific industries operating in a specific way. Decisions that created the fuel load and the fire risk that turned an ordinary autumn fire season into a catastrophe without precedent. That distinction matters, not because it means that any individual logger or company owner woke up on October 8th, 1871, intending to burn a town down. Nobody intended that, but intending harm and creating harm are not the same thing. The slash was real. The drought was real. The fires burning in the surrounding areas for weeks before the disaster were real and visible and known. And the choices that were made to keep working, to keep burning, to keep prioritizing the extraction of timber over any caution about the landscape being left behind were choices made by people, with consequences that fell on other people entirely. Peshtigo deserves to be remembered. Not as a footnote in the week of the Chicago fire, but as a story in its own right, about a community of ordinary people and an industry that treated the land they lived on as a resource to be consumed without consequence. It was the deadliest wildfire in American history. It was caused, in significant part, by decisions that prioritized profit over safety. And it was forgotten almost immediately, which is perhaps the final injustice in a story that contains more than its share of them. If you made it to the end of this video, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. The history that doesn't get taught in school. The disasters that get overshadowed. The industries that shape this country in ways most people never think about. That's what we cover here. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment telling us which forgotten historical event you think deserves this kind of coverage, and share this video with someone who thinks they know American history. because if they've never heard of Peshtigo, they might want to reconsider that.